Imagine standing at the mouth of a pitch-black cave. No flashlight, no safety rope, just a flickering flame in your hand and a cold wall of stone waiting somewhere in the dark. And here's the strange question. Why would our ancestors risk crawling hundreds of meters into a dangerous underground world just to paint animals they didn't even usually eat? The funny thing is, when cave paintings like the ones at Altamira were discovered in 1880, many European scientists didn't react with, "Wow, our ancestors were incredible." They reacted with, "Absolutely not." To them, hunter-gatherers were just primitive people, far too simple-minded to create art this sophisticated. History, as it turns out, has a real talent for embarrassing itself. But here's the problem. These paintings were not just random doodles made for fun. They were signs of a cognitive revolution that stretched across tens of thousands of years. Humans had begun using images to store ideas outside their own brains. Or, to put it more simply, long before writing existed, they had already turned cave walls into giant memory systems. And this is where the story gets interesting. For a long time, people believed Europe was the birthplace of cave art. Then the caves of Indonesia stepped onto the stage and basically said, "Hold on, look over here." In Sulawesi and Borneo, archaeologists found images so ancient that they shook the old story to its core. In Liang Karampuang Cave on Sulawesi, researchers discovered what may be the oldest known narrative artwork, dated to at least 51,200 years ago. On the cave wall, human-like figures appear to interact with a wild pig. This is not just an animal standing there like a prehistoric profile picture. It looks like a scene. There are characters. There is action. There is a moment unfolding. Basically, cave-era Netflix, just without subtitles. But wait, it gets even stranger. In Liang Metenduno Cave, a hand stencil covered by a layer of calcite has been dated to at least 67,800 years old. What makes it especially unusual is that the fingers seem to have been intentionally narrowed, almost like claws. That means very early humans may not have been simply saying, "I was here." They may have been transforming the handprint into a symbol. This completely changes how we think about prehistoric art. Symbolic thinking did not suddenly appear when humans arrived in Europe. It was already traveling with them across long migrations, even across the sea toward Sahul. In other words, before humans built cities, before they wrote books, before they carved laws into stone, they were already carrying imagination with them. But the biggest twist is this. Homo sapiens may not have been the only species making art. In Spain, hand stencils and symbols found in caves such as La Pasiega and Maltravieso have been dated to around 64,000 years ago, before modern humans are believed to have arrived in Europe. That points to a very unexpected candidate, the Neanderthals. And this is the part that should make us a little more humble. If Neanderthals were preparing pigments, bringing light into deep caves, and creating symbols, then art was not some exclusive VIP privilege reserved for Homo sapiens. It seems abstract thinking may have been more widespread across the genus Homo than we once believed. Our extinct cousins may not have been nearly as crude as older textbooks made them sound. So how do scientists know these paintings are really that ancient? They use ultrafine lasers to sample the thin layers of calcite covering the pigments, then analyze the uranium-thorium decay chain. As uranium slowly decays into thorium, it leaves behind a kind of chemical clock inside the stone. And thanks to that clock, walls that stayed silent for tens of thousands of years are finally beginning to speak back to us. But the story does not stop with the age of the paintings. What has made scientists even more excited recently is that they have begun finding ancient human DNA right on cave walls. No bones, no graves, just tiny traces still clinging to the stone. Think about that for a second. A hand touched a cave wall tens of thousands of years ago, and somehow, after all that time, it may still be leaving behind a biological whisper. And that is why hand stencils feel so powerful. They are not just a simple way of saying, "I was here." To make them, ancient people placed a hand against the rock and blew pigment around it, leaving behind a negative image, almost like a shadow frozen in place. It is a simple act, but it feels deeply human. A bit like writing your name on a school desk, except this version outlived entire civilizations. Now the story starts to feel a little warmer. Biometric analysis suggests that in some caves, as many as about 25% of the handprints belong to children. Not just teenagers, but very young children, some only a few years old. That means these caves were not filled only with adult hunters or mysterious shamans. Somewhere in that darkness, there were also the footsteps of children, moving through the cave with their community. At Rufinyak Cave, researchers found finger markings high up on the ceiling. The problem is, children could not have reached those places on their own. So the most likely explanation is that adults lifted them onto their shoulders so they could take part. Just picture that for a moment. Inside a dark cave, an adult bends down, raises a child up, and the child drags tiny fingers through soft clay. Suddenly, prehistory does not feel quite so distant anymore. This changes the cave from something cold and ceremonial into something much more alive. It starts to look like one of humanity's first art classrooms. Some areas contain so many traces left by children that they almost feel like practice spaces, places where kids drew, played, learned, and left signs behind. Adults were not only hunting to keep the group alive, they were also teaching the next generation how to see the world. But the big question is still waiting. Why did they paint in the first place? The classic explanation is hunting magic. According to this idea, if you painted an animal, especially a wounded one, you might somehow influence its spirit in the real world. It sounds a little like a prehistoric cheat code. But for people living with hunger, cold, and dangerous animals, any possible way to improve the odds of survival was probably worth trying. The problem is, archaeology does not fully cooperate with that theory. The animals painted most often, such as horses and bison, were not always the main things people were eating. At many campsites, reindeer bones show up far more often, yet reindeer are much less prominent on the cave walls. At Lascaux, horses and bulls take center stage, while the everyday dinner option is almost pushed off-screen. So another explanation takes things in a much more everyday direction. Maybe some cave art was made by adventurous teenagers exploring deep caves and sketching whatever caught their imagination. Researcher Dale Guthrie once argued that many drawings looked like the work of young males heading underground in search of excitement. In other words, long before social media, humans may already have had their own version of doing something reckless and leaving proof behind. That idea may ruin the sacred mood a little, but it is interesting. Some drawings are technically rough, almost like the work of beginners. The subjects also circle around things that naturally grab attention: dangerous animals, power, the human body, and images that feel intense or dramatic. So alongside serious rituals, caves may also have been places where young people experimented, learned, and showed off a little. But then another interpretation pulls the story back into deeper darkness: shamanism and altered states of consciousness. In this view, caves were not just places to make pictures. They were places where people entered the spirit world. Darkness, echoes, flickering firelight, and sensory isolation could all push the mind towards strange visions. And the half-human, half-animal beings painted on cave walls may be memories of those inner journeys. In that worldview, the cave wall was not just a slab of stone. It may have felt more like a thin membrane separating the world of the living from the world of spirits. Cracks, hollows, and natural bulges in the rock could have looked like small doorways. And when ancient artists painted an animal as if it were emerging from the wall, they may not have believed they were creating it. They may have believed they were pulling it out of the invisible world and into the firelight. That sounds mystical, but the brain has a very practical role in all of this. When people spend a long time in darkness, without familiar sounds or steady light, the brain starts searching for patterns. This is called pareidolia. Seeing a face in the clouds, an animal in a rock surface, or a sad little face on an electrical outlet. Humans, to put it gently, are extremely good at over-imagining things. And this is where modern science enters the story in a surprisingly fun way. Virtual reality experiments have shown that when people move through simulated caves with no paintings at all, they still tend to notice the same bumps, hollows, and shapes that prehistoric artists once chose for their images. In other words, our brains today still respond to stone, darkness, and form in a way that feels strangely close to our ancestors. Tens of thousands of years have passed, but the brain still loves playing, "What animal do you see?" But caves were not only places to look. They were places to listen. Deep in the dark, sound becomes strange. Footsteps travel farther, breathing echoes back, and a human voice can split into layers, almost as if something inside the stone is answering. And here's the surprising part. Some of the areas with the highest concentration of cave art also seem to have some of the most unusual acoustics. Places with strong echoes often contain more images, as if sound itself helped guide the art. In a few spots too narrow for large paintings, ancient people still left red dots behind, almost like a marker saying, "Something special is happening here." Echoes might have reminded them of galloping hooves, animal calls, or movement in the dark. At that point, the cave was no longer just an art gallery. It was the prehistoric version of a 4D theater. And they may even have used singing like a kind of biological radar. In total darkness, a long sustained note could help someone sense whether a chamber was wide or narrow, whether the path ended or continued deeper in. The echo became an invisible map, helping them navigate through a maze of stone. Long before GPS, our ancestors may have used their voices to ask the cave, "Hey, is there still a way forward?" But making art in a place like that took more than inspiration. It took technique. They had to prepare animal fat lamps for steady light with minimal smoke. They had to bring pigments, tools, and sometimes even build wooden scaffolding to reach high walls. At Lascaux, marks left in the cave suggest they may have installed wooden supports so they could stand high enough to create those enormous murals. And this is the part that makes modern people pause a little. They also knew how to transform color with fire. Iron oxide, or ochre, could be heated to different temperatures to produce vivid, long-lasting shades of red. This was not just pick up some colored dirt and smear it on the wall. It was closer to an early form of chemistry. Before laboratories existed, humans had already learned to use fire to turn matter into meaning. At Lascaux, the story becomes even more ordered. Researchers studying the layers of pigment found that the artists seemed to have followed a sequence. Horses were often painted first, then bison, and finally deer. This was not a random paint whatever you feel like situation. It looks more like a rule-based ritual repeated across different parts of the cave. Suddenly, the cave starts to feel like a book, except its pages were written in animals, red pigment, and darkness. And the twist is that this sequence may be connected to the seasons. Horses appear with biological signs linked to early spring, bison carry features associated with summer, and deer with large antlers point toward autumn. So these paintings may not have been only about animals. They may have been telling the story of life cycle, breeding, movement, molting, antler growth, return, and disappearance. A giant biological calendar, painted deep beneath the earth. And if that is true, then caves were not just shelters from cold rain or dangerous animals. They may have been giant calendars, stone temples where humans recorded the rhythm of nature itself. Spring arrived and animals bred. Summer came and the bison changed. Autumn appeared and deer grew their antlers. In the darkness, they were not just painting animals. They were painting time. But the story does not end with animals. Alongside horses, bison, deer, and handprints, prehistoric people also left behind dozens of repeating geometric signs across the caves of Europe. Lines, dots, triangles, arcs, grids. At first glance, they look like someone practicing geometry homework during a Wi-Fi outage. But the problem is, they appear far too often to be random. Even stranger, many of these signs were repeated for roughly 30,000 years. That means this was not just one person doodling for fun and walking away. It may have been a kind of proto-writing, a way to store information long before writing was invented. Those marks may have carried messages about territory, hunting seasons, danger, social groups, or memories the community needed to pass down. Then there are the handprints with missing fingers, a mystery that once led many people to imagine disease, accidents, or even finger-cutting rituals. Dramatic, yes. Very cinematic. But newer analyses suggest another possibility. The fingers may simply have been folded down while pigment was sprayed around the hand. If that is true, these were not injuries. They were gestures. And here is where things get really interesting. Linguists have noticed that many of the finger positions found in Garga's cave can be made easily with one hand in the air. They resemble a kind of early sign language, possibly used during hunting to communicate without making noise. Because obviously, if you are stalking a large animal, yelling, "Hey, it's over there," is not exactly a brilliant strategy. Seen from that angle, cave art was not just decoration. It was a social communication network. Paintings, handprints, and signs helped groups share information, recognize one another, remember places, and strengthen identity. Long before maps, documents, phones, or painfully loud family group chats, humans had stone walls. And during the harsh Ice Age, that may have been a matter of survival. When resources were scarce, the climate was brutal, and groups had to move across long distances. Shared symbols could reduce conflict and build trust. A mark inside a cave might say, "This place belongs to the ancestors. This is hunting ground. This is a shared memory." Art did not just make life more beautiful. It may have helped humans survive together. But here is the sad part. These caves survived tens of thousands of years of ice, earthquakes, floods, and darkness. And yet the thing threatening them most today is us. The breath of visitors raises humidity and carbon dioxide levels. Artificial lights, bacteria, and mold begin attacking the pigments. Our ancestors spent millennia sending a message forward in time, and we can blur it in just a few decades. That is why many original caves have had to close, while humans create 3D replicas such as Lascaux II and Lascaux IV. Lasers scan every crack, every trace of color, every curve of the stone to reproduce the caves with astonishing accuracy. It may feel disappointing that we cannot step into the originals, but it is a necessary trade-off. Sometimes, to protect the past, we have to stand a little farther away from it. In the end, cave art is not just a story about ancient paintings. It is the moment humans began saying to the universe, "We were here." In the darkness, they painted animals, hands, symbols, fears, beliefs, and imagination itself. So the next time you absent-mindedly doodle a few lines on paper, remember that this tiny act has a very deep history. Maybe, from the very beginning, humans never wanted only to survive. We wanted to be remembered.